Hello, gang. It is I, Professor Mop Top. Welcome to another week here of my Patreon update. As always, thank you a million times over. And as always, you're going to be getting a treat in the mail. This week, you're going to be getting 4 hunks of audio about 3 pieces of music. And they're all very interesting because they're all part of the Sgt. Pepper album. And as you may or may not know, every single thing about Sgt. Pepper is interesting. The first song you're going to hear about is Getting Better, which goes all the way back to 1964, sort of. A guy named Jimmy Nicol was hired to replace Ringo when Ringo was sick in the hospital with tonsillitis. Hello, honey pie. Jimmy Nicol played quite a few shows with the Beatles, a small handful, and after each show they would say, "How'd it go?" And he kept saying, "It's getting better every day." And Paul remembered this phrase in early 1967 when he was writing songs for the Sgt. Pepper album. He wrote Getting Better, and then John came over, and the two of them finished it together. It's it's a perfect example of how John and Paul complemented one another, because Paul sings the very, very optimistic, "It's getting better," and if you listen closely in the background vocal, John chimes in with, "It couldn't get no worse," which, of course, is just the opposite. It's very clever, very well written. When they recorded the song, they were, as they did with Sgt. Pepper, we're trying to get new sounds all throughout the entire record. And for this, George Martin actually opened up a piano and either plucked the strings or hit him with a hammer. There's also a tambora that George plays on the track, and George Martin plays a mini harpsichord on it. There's a lot going on in Getting Better. Fixin' a Hole is the other hunk of audio you're going to hear about. This is where Paul says that he gets into weird territory. Now, there's some questionable inspirations about where specifically the title and the concept of Fixin' a Hole came from. A lot of people thought it was drugs, specifically hard drugs, but there's a pretty good chance that Paul McCartney was just trying to write lyrics that were unusual and strange and weird. Professor Mop Top goes into great detail all about how Paul thought about the titles of this song specifically, which was co-written with Mal Evans, who is another fifth Beatle. He was an assistant for them throughout their entire career, and Paul worked on the song with him. Sadly, Mal Evans passed away in 1976. George Harrison plays an excellent guitar solo on Fixin' a Hole, which is double-tracked, and the background vocals were a little bit more traditional than they had been in the past couple years, where it was one guy singing and 2 guys singing background vocals, as opposed to multi-tracking and such and such. And the third song you're going to hear about this week is called She's Leaving Home. It was written by Paul, and it was inspired by a girl named Melanie Co, who was a runaway in England, and there was a story about her in the newspaper, and Paul read it and started writing about a song about She's Leaving Home. John likely contributed to this, and there's a big orchestra on it. Not a huge orchestra, but Paul was getting more and more ambitious as a composer. He and George Martin had collaborated together on Beatles songs, as well as in a movie called The Family Way, where they scored the soundtrack for it. When Paul was ready to score it, he didn't quite know how to do it, and he needed help. He was impatient, and George Martin was busy with a Cilla Black session, so Paul hired a guy named Mike Leander to do it. He had met Mike Leander in the past. He did the score for Marianne Faithfull's version of Yesterday. So on that alone, Paul thought this guy is good enough to help. George Martin was a little bit hurt because Paul was impatient about it. However, he did an excellent job on it. Also playing harp on She's Leaving Home is a woman named Sheila Bromberg. She is the very first woman to play on a Beatle record. I always find that very interesting. Paul and John do the vocals, and what's really interesting about She's Leaving Home is that there are no Beatles performing on it. It's nothing but the orchestra and the vocals. It's unusual to think of that very early in their career they didn't want anyone else to play on their records, and now they were getting to the point that there was none of them that were playing on the record. Thank you, as always, for downloading the WeTransfers when you get them and checking your email. I hope that you all have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you again. In the meantime, happy Beatling.